Okay, I guess we can start. Let's see. First of all, I have to apologize. I again didn't get up the last lecture until probably didn't get actually where you could get it until this morning. That's probably going to happen again. Although what I'm planning to do is try to get the necessary software on my other computer so that I don't have to. The reason this is happening is because I don't want to tie this computer up during the couple hours it takes to upload the stuff. I'll try to put it on a different computer. But what's also happening a little bit, sometimes you're not finding things because for some reason that I don't understand, CCLE is sometimes hiding stuff that's actually there. And somebody writes and says it's not there, and I look and it is there, and then I say, oh, it's not something I'm doing, it's something the system is doing. Hopefully, it doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. I apologize for that. If there's anybody in here or listening who's not here, who's having, well, let me try it this way. Who can't find the quizzes? Or the study section, the answer sheets? Okay, well, there's some people that probably aren't here that can't. And so for those of you that are listening, you go to CCLE and they're there. So I don't quite know what's happening. If you can't find something that you need, contact me or contact Natasha or something. I guess that's it for announcements. So I guess the evolution thing closed last night at midnight. I'll get the answers posted for that, or the explanations posted for that later today. Is there anything else I should be? Okay. Huh?
I'm assuming you'll post them onto the neuroanatomy and...
Yeah, the neuroanatomy ones will go pretty soon. Yeah. I'll get them up this weekend. Oh, and the grade. Oh yeah, let me just say that my UCLA now has your scores such as they are. The first study section thing. I guess you put this out as a notice. I'm just remind you that it shows your raw scores. If you've got 75% correct, you'll get full credit.
Yeah, but they show up at points.
They show right now. They show up at points. We'll correct that later on. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So we're beginning to talk about nerve cells at the end of last time. And we talked about the fact that they're in the resting condition, there's a voltage difference between the inside and outside of the nerve cell, with the inside being negative by somewhere between 60 and 90 millivolts, usually. Millivolts are 1/1000th of a volt. So we indicated this here by popping a little so-called microelectrode inside the cell, measuring the voltage between the inside and the outside of the cell. And when the electrode popped in, the voltage across the cell membrane went from 0 to, in this case, about minus 90 or something like that. These I've separated into several slides and things that what you have as printouts as one slide right now, just to make things a little clearer. So nerve cells talk to one another by means of synapses, and there are two kinds of synapses. There are excitatory synapses and inhibitory synapses. Let's talk about the excitatory ones first. The excitatory synapses have the effect that when the presynaptic cell is active and sends an excitatory message to the postsynaptic cell, it does something to the postsynaptic cell that encourages it, not necessarily causes it, but encourages it to produce a message of its own, produce a nerve impulse of its own. And so I want to tell you in this slide a little bit about how that happens. And the sequence of events is this. The first thing that happens, suppose we have a nerve cell, an excitatory input here, which is active. So the nerve impulse coming down to the end, a presynaptic message, or a presynaptic nerve impulse in this neuron here. In fact, I have that happening in all four of these red guys here. That's the first. So the first is a message. The message arriving at the terminal of each of these solid red axons causes a chemical substance that's inside of those terminals called a chemical transmitter substance to be released. There are a number of different kinds of chemical transmitters, probably, depending on how you classify things, 3 or 4, a dozen, or maybe more, depending upon exactly how you're talking about it. But there's a limited number, but a lot more, not just one. These chemical transmitters, when the nerve impulse comes to the end, a little puff of them gets released from the terminal. That oozes or flows or diffuses across the gap, the small gap between the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell. And those chemicals that are released cross the gap. The gap happens very, very fast because it's a very short distance. And they bind, diffuses across the gap. That's step 3. The transmitter diffuses across the gap, or the synaptic cleft, as it's called, the synaptic gap. When the transmitter in question hits the postsynaptic cell, there are receptor molecules there that it gloms onto, that bind to it. So the transmitter binds the postsynaptic receptors for that particular transmitter that are there. There may be more than one kind of receptor there, but there will be some for this particular kind of transmitter that's released, and the transmitter will bind to them. When that happens, some events occur, which we'll talk a little bit about in a little while. Some events occur which turn the cell membrane, right where the binding occurs, into a little battery. And this is a battery which opposes the resting situation. So in the resting situation, the inside is negative and the outside is positive. When this excitatory transmitter binds to the receptors for the excitatory transmitter, in that region, in a localized fashion, it switches. And the inside, it turns into a little battery in which the inside is positive and the outside is negative. Just the other way around. So that's what's indicated here by inside plus, outside minus in that region. So whereas at rest, it's like this, inside negative, outside positive. Where there is where excitatory transmitter is found, it's inside positive, outside negative. Just the other way around. And that causes the membrane potential to go from being down here at the resting level to a much less negative level. Or to not necessarily a much less negative level, but to a somewhat less negative level. This kind of movement up here, movement in away from the resting potential in an upward direction towards 0, or even maybe beyond 0, is referred to as a depolarization. Because when one says, well, there's a polarization at rest, inside negative polarization of the cell membrane, when that goes partially or fully or whatever away, it's a depolarization. That's the terminology that's used. So excitation, excitatory transmitter binding to the postsynaptic membrane causes a depolarization. And if you get one little slug of transmitter release, sort of one puff, which is what happens when the nerve impulse reaches the end here, then that produces a transient depolarization, which typically lasts about 20 to 50 milliseconds. And I kind of drawn a picture of it. So it goes up, it comes down, like so. This depolarization produced by excitatory transmitters are referred to as excitatory postsynaptic potentials, or excitatory postsynaptic voltages. And because it's such a mouthful, they're usually abbreviated. In fact, they're almost always abbreviated when just being discussed as EPSPs. So that's something you need to, terminology you need to, all this terminology you need to remember. It's the concepts and the information that is important, but you can't talk about it a lot of times without the terms. So there's a tendency on people's part to memorize terms, and you do have to do that to some extent, but it's only, the terms are only a vehicle for communicating. They themselves are not important. It's the concepts that are important. Yeah?
Does that mean we'll never be quizzed when the terms themselves independent of the concepts that you express?
I would probably never have a question that says, what does such and such mean? Does it mean this, this, or this? But I would certainly use the terms freely in asking the question. Now, I don't want to guarantee I would never do that, but I would not tend to do it. I'll never make any promises of any kind about an exam, but that would usually be the case. The exception is anatomy. Yeah. Okay, so we've got these excitatory, active excitatory nerve terminals, releasing transmitter, binding to the postsynaptic cell, causing a depolarization. An EPSP, excitatory postsynaptic potential. And so this is just a copy of what I showed you on the previous slide. We've got a microelectrode in this case, stuck right here in the dendrite, right under one of these active synapses. In practice, you can't usually really do that. There are special cases where you can. Often it's very difficult. So this EPSP is generated at the synapse. But nerve impulses do not get generated at the synapse. Nerve impulses get generated here at the beginning of the axon, if they're going to get generated. If a nerve cell is going to produce a nerve impulse, that's where it'll start. It's over here, not over here. Now, these excitatory postsynaptic potentials, which are generated out here, do make it over to here. They gradually, the farther away they get from where they started, the smaller they get. But by the time they get way over here, they're still of measurable size. The reason they spread just has to do with physics. You've got a pile of positive charge and a pile of negative charge there. The membrane itself keeps it separated to some extent, but there's nothing to prevent it from moving sideways, along either away or towards the cell body or the axon. And so some of that charge drifts in this direction. And so there's still some depolarization even by the time you get over here to where nerve impulses are able to begin. So if we make the measurement here, we get a great big EPSP. But if we make the measurement over here, I'm sorry, I keep using the word spikes. I'll define it in a minute. Where nerve impulses normally begin, it's still there, but much smaller. That spread occurs very, very, very fast. Very fast. Much faster than nerve impulses move. As you go from here to here, from here to here, this goes from here to here. So no nerve impulses yet, just EPSPs so far. Now, why do we get nerve impulses? How do we get nerve impulses? Well, we get nerve impulses when the depolarization at the beginning of the axon here, at this point here, the beginning of the axon, gets big enough. And there's a certain critical amount of depolarization that any given nerve cell has to have in order for that nerve cell to produce a nerve impulse. And that amount is called the critical firing level, or sometimes the threshold of the nerve cell. And this is a fairly accurate drawing in the sense that if this is this is 0 and this is the resting potential down here, the critical firing level would probably, be it wouldn't be way up here somewhere, and it wouldn't probably be way down there. It would be somewhere, quarter of the way, a third of the way up, something like that. In this case, picture here, what's happened is I've imagined that you had two different excitatory inputs to this postsynaptic cell, and the inputs are firing. I'm sorry I keep using that term. I'll define it in just a moment. These inputs are being active, having nerve impulses at somewhat different times. This one here, this one. So this one was active here, here, and here. This one was active here, and so on. Each one produces an EPSP, and what you see is these EPSPs, if one starts before the next one is over, they ride piggyback on one another. And over here what happened, there were several of them close enough together that it got up to the critical firing level. When it gets up, when the membrane voltage, the voltage across the membrane, gets depolarized up to the critical firing level here at the beginning of the axon, a nerve impulse is produced. That's what produces a nerve impulse. When that nerve impulse is produced, that nerve message is produced, it then, as we've already talked about, spreads down the axon. It propagates down the axon at the range of speeds that a car can drive. How fast it goes depends upon the properties of the particular nerve cell in question. It actually also usually often goes backwards into the cell body. It does not usually go, I don't have the dendrites pictured on this slide, but it does not usually go into the dendrites except under special circumstances that we're not going to talk about. Okay. This nerve impulse is so important that there are a lot of synonyms for it. And these are all equivalent, for our purposes, these are all equivalent terms. Sometimes it's called a spike. The reason it's called a spike is, here it is. It's very brief, and it's very big, and so it looks spiky. And so looking at a record like this, it's not surprising one would call that a spike, and so physiologists call it a spike. The nerve impulse itself, the spike, is much shorter than a typical EPSP. It's only about 1 millisecond long, whereas these EPSPs are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 milliseconds long. This spike, or nerve message, or nerve impulse, is also called an action potential. And these are terms you need to know. It's called an action potential. And when one is produced, we say that the nerve cell fires, because it's this big, sudden, big event. Moreover, as I mentioned to you briefly in an earlier lecture, this is an all or none event. You either get a message or you don't get a message. There are no big messages and little messages. They're just messages. The nerve cell either does or doesn't at any one moment of time have a message going in it or produced in it. So we refer to these spikes as being all or none. That's, I think, everything we look at. Yes?
The nerve impulse, the EPSP is up until the point of nerve impulse.
Well, okay, yeah. So what happens is that it actually continues on over here. But so what happens is you've got the EPSP, it gets up to the critical firing level, you get your spike. After the spike, there's some events that we're not going to talk about that cause the membrane to go, membrane potential to go down for a moment.
Okay.
And then once that's finished happening, the EPSP may be still left to some extent, and it continues tapering off.
Existing in the axon or in the cell?
Existing out here where it started, and therefore also existing at the beginning of the axon.
Okay.
If you recorded here, it would probably still be present, even smaller. If you recorded way over here, it would probably be gone. It just basically fades away the farther away you get from where it originated.
Okay.
Okay, now there's a little bit of more terminology associated with this picture. Not much. This is more or less the same picture. So you typically only get spikes or action potentials if you have the adding up of a number of EPSPs. There are special cases where one EPSP is able to produce a spike, but in most cases, in most nerve cells, that's not the case. You have to have several EPSPs adding up in some way, and those, in order for that to happen, they have to come close enough to get their time so that one can ride piggyback on another. And those EPSPs can come from two different places or both from the same place. In this case, here we've got two adding up that came from this A guy here. Here we have an addition of one from B adding to what's left from the ones from A, and so on. So they don't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where they came from. If they're produced, they add. We say then that the EPSPs sum. We call this summation. And so you usually have to have summation in order to get a nerve cell depolarized enough to make it fire. There is some terminology which we probably won't ask. Well, I don't guarantee we won't ask on an exam. We probably shouldn't, but we might. People make a distinction between temporal summation and spatial summation. In this case, you've got adding up of something coming from the same place over time. So that's sometimes referred to as temporal summation. Here, for example, here and here, you've got the addition of something coming from over here to something that was coming from over here. So that's kind of spatial summation, because it's two different places in space, although it's also an adding up in time. So usually you have a complex mix of spatial and temporal summation, so it's not really a very useful term. Really what's important is to realize that things from coming in from different inputs can add, and they add over time. And so the terminology is not so important, though again, I don't promise we won't ask about it. Yes?
So does that mean that there's nothing special about the electrical signal itself that determines like the kind of message it produces?
That's right.
Really? Okay.
We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes.
Okay.
Spike is a spike is a spike is a spike.
Then what's the importance of like different types of neurotransmitters?
You'll see in a minute. Oh, okay. I'll just answer that question briefly. Different kinds of okay, first of all, one big difference is that some neurotransmitters are excitatory and others are inhibitory. I'll talk about that just in a minute. Another thing that we will talk about a little bit probably in a week or two, week and a half, is the fact that some neurotransmitters, there are actually three categories of neurotransmitters. There are ones that are excitatory, which is what I just talked about, which turn the membrane into a little battery. There are ones that are inhibitory, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then there are a raft of different ones that are actually called neuromodulators. And what they do is they do some fancier stuff. They basically set various metabolic things going in various ways inside the nerve cell. They set so-called intracellular signaling systems going. We'll talk a little bit about that, I think, later on. Not now, though. Okay, not quite too. I want to talk about inhibition, but not quite yet. Now, it often happens. Well, okay, suppose we have a EPSP like this, just got above the critical firing level for a moment. Then you probably get one spike. Because by the time, oh, sorry, that is something I didn't just say. These spikes, I don't actually have this. Oh, yeah, I do have it right here. These spikes can't come infinitely fast. Once a spike, things happen during a spike that basically tires the spike generating mechanism out. And so they need a little rest. There's a lot known about it. We know exactly what happens, but I'm not going to be talking about it. They need a little rest before they can produce, before another spike can be produced. And that period, there's a name for that period during which they can't produce another spike, and that's called the refractory period. They're refractory to being able to produce another nerve impulse. And that refractory period is on the range of probably about 1.5 to 5 or 6 milliseconds, something like that, depending upon various circumstances. Okay, so if we got just one guy here, this may have stayed above the critical firing level for a moment, but not long enough for more than one spike to be produced. But if it stayed up longer, then you'd have time for several spikes to be produced. Spike, refractory period, spike, refractory period, spike. By the time, only 3 though, because after the third spike, the EPSP dipped down below the critical firing level. It's not only is it the case that if the EPSP is bigger and above threshold for longer, you have time to get more spikes. It's also the case that it actually fires faster. So this refractory period is not absolute. It's sort of, the more depolarized it is, the shorter it is, up to a point. You can't get things closer than about a millisecond or a millisecond and a half, but whereas here, notice the delay between one spike and the next is, say it's 5 milliseconds or 4 milliseconds. Over here, maybe it's 1 or 2 milliseconds. We assume that the duration of the CPSP was 20 or 30 milliseconds, something like that. So the farther the membrane potential is above the resting level, the faster the spikes can come one after the other, up to a point. And so a neuron downstream that's receiving input from this guy, the cell that we're looking at, can get some sense of how strongly excited this guy was by what the firing rate of this cell is, how fast it's getting nerve messages from this cell. And that's referred to as the frequency or rate code. And it's the crucial medium by which one nerve cell can tell from another, tell how important something was or how strong the signal was that came into it.
So each spike is in a different message?
Each spike is a separate message, but each spike produces a depolarization. Those depolarizations can sum, and what really is read out by the postsynaptic cell is depolarization, the EPSP, and the sum DPSP. Okay, so as I said, there are two kinds of inputs to a nerve cell, at least two kinds, two important kinds that we're talking about right now. Excitatory ones, which is what we just talked about, and inhibitory ones. The inhibitory ones, let me go back and look. I don't think I have this. So let me go back a minute. I should have this on. I should modify it, but this is good enough. Typically, the excitatory inputs to a cell are out on the dendrites, as shown here. The inhibitory ones are usually closer to the spike-initiating regions here. They are both on the cell body and at the base of the dendrites, typically. So the inhibitory synapses are usually, this is not always true, but for our purposes, the inhibitory synapses are stuck in between, roughly speaking, the excitatory synapses and the spikes have to start. And what the inhibitory synapses do is they do two things. One thing they do is they actually shrink. They actually decrease the extent to which the EPSP that originated out here spreads over here. So they basically make the membrane electrically leaky. So this electrical charge that's spreading from here to over here, where it has to get, if a nerve message is going to start, doesn't spread as well. As they become electrically leaking, a lot of the electrical charge leaks out and doesn't get over to the spot. And so if you have these guys being active and producing inhibition, the EPSP that's produced over here for a given EPSP here will be smaller than it otherwise would be. That's one thing they do. The other thing they do is they actually make the nerve membrane potential, they lower the baseline down to here somewhere a little bit. So whereas here's the resting potential where things normally start from. If you have inhibitory action, the membrane potential is down here. So therefore, given size EPSP riding on it has farther to go to get up to the critical firing level. So both those things decrease the ability of the excitation to fire the postsynaptic cell. That's illustrated, I think, better on the slide we were originally looking at. Here's an EPSP without any inhibition. Here is an inhibitory synapse with transmitter coming down to the end and the inhibitory transmitter being released. And that also turns the postsynaptic membrane there into a little battery, but it's a battery that's the opposite sign, and it's actually makes the inside even more negative than it would be at rest. And so it is said that it hyperpolarizes the cell. So whereas excitatory input depolarizes the cell, inhibitory input hyperpolarizes the cell, though not by very much. And so here is what happened when we activated, when an inhibitory transmitter fell on the cell due to a spike having arrived along this inhibitory axon. And then if at this point here we activated this guy, we get an EPSP, but first of all, it's obviously much, much smaller in this fellow. It's the same guy, but it shrunk due to the leakiness because the electrical charge leaked out in getting from the excitatory synapse to this region where we're reporting. And also, it's starting down, obviously, at a much lower level. So it's got farther to go to get up here to the critical firing level. So this inhibition does both things. And we're not going to talk about the detailed mechanisms of inhibition, but they're not really two independent things. They both result from the same causes. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about how all these properties are used in just a moment. But as I told you before, there are three kinds of nerve cells. There are sensory neurons, there are motor neurons, and there are interneurons. Interneurons being neurons that receive input from other nerve cells. Sensory neurons being neurons that are activated out in the periphery and send information into the nervous system. And motor neurons being neurons that originate in the nervous system and send their axons out to muscles and glands and things like that, and actually cause things to happen. So let me just talk a little bit about sensory neurons. First of all, in sensory neurons, what happens is that there are different kinds of sensory neurons. There are ones that react to light. There are ones that react to sound. The ones with light are obviously in the eye. The ones with sound, obviously in the ear. There are ones that react to various skin senses, and there are different ones for touch, cold, heat, and damage. Damage receptors are sometimes called pain receptors. In order to feel pain, you usually have to actually have a little bit of tissue damage, and there are nerve cells that are specifically sensitive to such damage. They're called pain receptors. I don't have that listed here, but that's the case. Now, these different kinds of receptors that sense different things are named for what they react best to. They don't react only to those things, but they react best to those things. So, for example, if I poke a light receptor neuron hard enough, it'll probably fire. But in real life, that doesn't normally happen. So we call it a light receptor because it's most sensitive to light, not because it's only exclusively sensitive. Now, the thing, when the physical thing for which a receptor is, which a given receptor is designed to detect occurs, what that thing does is it depolarizes the receptor. that depolarization for all the world is just like an EPSP, except that we don't call it an EPSP, we call it a generator potential. But once it's produced, everything about sensory neurons is just like any other neurons. If the neuron is depolarized enough, it fires and all the rest of it. Okay, so sensory neurons have generator potentials produced in them by a physical stimulus, and typically the stronger the physical stimulus, the more depolarized they get, and if the physical stimulus is strong enough, they fire. And if it's really strong, they fire at a high rate. If it's not so strong, they fire at a lower rate. So everything else is just the same as with other kinds of nerve cells. Sensory neurons are nerve cells, but they're ones that have a special job. Now, as I told you just a moment ago, receptors are named for the thing that they are most sensitive to and what their job really is. But you can usually excite them in other ways. So, for example, if I heat up a touch receptor enough, it will fire. Or if I squeeze a heat receptor enough, it will fire. And the question arises, what you experience if you heat the right guy up with the wrong stimulus, or the wrong guy up with the right stimulus. And that is to say, suppose I activate a cold receptor by squeezing it real hard. Do I feel touch? Or what do I perceive? Do I perceive, or what do I sense? Do I sense touch, or pressure, or something like that? Or pain? Or do I sense cold? The answer is I perceive cold. Because what determines how the activity of a receptor is interpreted by the brain depends not on what made the not what made the neuron fire, not what made the sensory neuron fire, but where in the brain that thing, or where in the nervous system that thing goes. And the thing that's different about these different receptors, in terms of their actions, in terms of producing experiences, is that different ones go to different places. So the ones in the eyes go one place in the brain, the ears go a different place. The cold ones go to one place, the warm ones to a slightly different place, the touch ones to a slightly different place. So it's where they go that determines what you perceive. And this was discovered by a long since dead physiologist by the name of Johannes Müller, who had a law called Müller's Law, or somebody else called it Müller's Law of Specific Nerve Energies. And what it basically says, not in his words, is no matter what makes a sensory neuron fire, the firing causes a sensation appropriate to what the sense organ is. It's where in the brain the information goes that determines what we feel. That's very important. So that's all I'm going to say about sensory neurons. Let me talk just briefly about motor neurons. So motor neurons, as I told you before, are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord and corresponding parts of the brainstem for the patients, for nerves of the head, or for muscles of the head. Each motor neuron sends an axon out to some muscle, and it typically branches there. Now, muscles are made up of independent fibers, each of which is a contractile element, an independent contractile element. Typically, any given one motor neuron will make contact with a small group of muscle fibers. What happens there is if this neuron fires, axon goes out and goes into all of the branches and causes transmitter release there, just like for any other neuron. That transmitter release now, however, is not going to go spread to another neuron. It's going to spread to the muscle fibers that it makes contact with, which it does. So transmitter release, which it does. And where it makes a contact with the muscle fiber, you have basically an excitatory synapse, just like the excitatory synapse inside the nervous system. And so it causes a depolarization. And this is a case where commonly even one firing by one nerve cell could cause a depolarization that's big enough to actually cause a spike. So this is one of the exceptions I mentioned. Inside the nervous system, that's rare. In muscles, it's common. Not universal, but common. So you get a spike, and once the spike is produced in one of these muscle fibers, it propagates along the fiber exactly the same way an action potential. It's an action potential, it's a spike, and it propagates just the way a spike would propagate along an axon in a nerve cell. The mechanisms are exactly the same. So it spreads away, moves away quite rapidly in both directions away from the point where it started in each of the nerve fibers in which it's produced. And when you get the spike, when the muscle fiber, when the muscle fiber is depolarized by the spike, that causes the contraction. We're not going to talk about the details of how that happens. That's another long story, but it causes a contraction. If you have a lot of motor neurons firing, a lot of motor neurons that go to a given muscle firing, you'll have a lot of nerve fibers active, and so you have a lot of these guys pulling in parallel, and so you'll get more powerful overall contraction of the muscle than if you have only a few. If any one guy is firing at a high rate and releasing messages fast and causing a high rate of spikes in a given muscle fiber, that muscle fiber will pull harder than it would if the spike rate in the muscle fiber were lower. So it's all kind of just like with the nerve cells, sort of. I mean, once you know about the nerve cells, the rest follows more or less similar rules. So that's all I want to say about motor neurons. And interneurons we've already talked about. We've talked about excitation, we've talked about inhibition, and that's the whole game there. So we've already talked about all the most basic things, basic tools that nerve cells have to communicate with one another. But what's important about the nervous system is not just these tools, but how they're used. Basically, the nervous system is a machine, a biological machine for doing information processing and computations that will result in behavior. Let me just give you two very simple, slightly hokey, but not totally unrealistic examples of how the stuff we're talking about is used. So we talked about the flexion reflex, the one where you step on a toe, you step on a nail, and you bend at all the oval joints. So basically, that reflex is started by pain receptors. These are these particular kind of receptors that are responsible for damage. Now, if one of these guys fires at a very low rate, so here's the pain receptor firing. Suppose I stimulate this guy very mildly, so it's firing but at a very low rate. Then what will happen, it will ultimately, it's going to typically make connections with other neurons, which will eventually, the pain receptor makes connections with some neurons, which makes some connections with some other neurons, which after some various neurons in series, will eventually make synapses on some neuron, which when it fires does something that feeds into the motor circuitry that actually produces the flexion response. This isn't necessarily the motor neuron itself. It might be some higher order neuron that in turn connects with the motor neuron. But it's a neuron which, when it fires, it actually causes the animal, it promotes the flexion reflex. So it causes or promotes the flexion reflex. We could call it a flexion reflex command neuron or something like that. Any case, this guy, so here we're imagining what the depolarization or what the electrical activity in this neuron might look like as we stimulate the pain receptor. So with a weak stimulus, the pain receptor is firing every so often, and that's producing ultimately an EPSP. EPSP is like so in this, quote, flexion command neuron. They're not getting up to the critical firing level, so there's no behavior at all being produced. Suppose now we stimulate this guy more. Now these guys are riding piggyback on this. Sorry, now these guys are firing faster, and spikes are coming in to this neuron faster, and so the EPSPs are riding piggyback on one another. But in this case, in this example, they were not firing quite fast enough, at least up to that point in time, to get up to critical firing level. So at least up to that point in time, there would be no behavioral reaction. From the picture, you would presume that the next spike or two would have crossed the firing level, and this neuron would have fired, and that would have caused at least some small flexion reflex probably. Here's a case where we gave a still stronger stimulus. Here it did cross the critical firing level of this guy, and so because this guy fired, it produced a real full-fledged flexion reflex in response to the hurting of the limb, the damage to the limb. So that's kind of the kinds of way these rules that we talked about are used. Let's look at one other kind of example. Very common in the nervous system that you want something to happen, you want some behavior to occur, or something to happen, when a number of different independent conditions are simultaneously fulfilled. So to give you an example of this, suppose you have a neuron here that this is very trunked up, but it's not so very different from the way things really work. Suppose you have a neuron here which, when it fires, feeds into circuitry, neural circuitry, motor circuitry that causes running. Things are kind of organized like that. Suppose that you see, suppose you have some neurons here that, due to all sorts of complex circuitry prior to them, are selectively responsive to, on the one hand, cats, whatever the properties of cats are, whiskers, whatever of cats. You've got some other neurons that simply respond to size. Big things they respond to, little things they don't respond to. And imagine you've got some other neurons that respond to things that are striped. There actually are neurons in the nervous system that do all those things. So we're going to imagine we have these guys. Now, if you wanted to have it, arrange things so that running would happen not when you had a cat present, not when you had any large thing present, and not when you had any striped thing present, but only when you had a large striped cat. Then you would wire things up like so. You'd have this guy here receive input from each of these three neurons. And suppose that, actually maybe we can do this. On the next slide. The next slide might be better. No, let's go back to this for a moment. And suppose that the firing of each of these neurons caused, let us say, a 2 millivolt depolarization. Then if we wanted this neuron here to fire only when we had a tiger, i.e. a large striped cat, and not for anything else, then if each of these inputs produced a 2 millivolt EPSP, what would we want to make the critical firing level for this guy? 6, right. And that's kind of game the nervous system plays over and over and over and over again. But I just remembered something I forgot to tell you, which might well appear on an exam, so let me go back just a moment. Oops, I went the wrong way. There. What I forgot to tell you was that this hyperpolarization that's produced by an inhibitory input is called an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, to contrast it with the excitatory postsynaptic potentials that are produced by excitatory synapses. So this is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, usually referred to as an IPSP. And so be sure to remember that. Okay, so in this example from the flexion reflex and from the tiger detector, or the thing that causes the running response to a tiger, these examples are simply meant to emphasize and point out that the kinds of, or give illustrations of the fact that what the nervous system does is it does kind of logical jobs. It does computations that lead to behavior using these rules that we talked about. And in fact, in this case, we say that this is often referred to as an AND gate, because this neuron fires only when this and this and this condition are all true, i.e. it's a cat, it's large, and it's striped. By changing the threshold here, we can make what, if you had any logic courses, we can make OR gates and so on. So that's kind of what the nervous system does. All right, Freddy the robot with a red boy brain, I don't think we're going to see. I'm going too slowly. Okay, but I do want to go now into a little bit more specific detail about some of the mechanisms that are responsible for the resting potential and action potentials and EPSPs and so on. So let's talk first of all just about the rest of it. The fluids outside the medium outside and inside of nerve cells has all sorts of molecules floating around there. And those molecules are always moving around. That's the fundamental law of physics. They only stop moving at absolute zero temperature, which you're long since dead to get there, so it's irrelevant for our purposes. So they're always moving around. And there are some particular molecules that are involved in the activity of the nervous system that are particularly important to us. And these molecules are referred to as ions. And what ions are is they are atoms that have either gained or lost electrons. If they've gained an electron, they become negatively charged. If they've lost an electron, they become positively charged. And these atoms that have gained or lost electrons, and therefore become electrically charged, are called ions. Just out of curiosity, how many of you already know that? Good. I would hope you would have learned it probably somewhere in the line. That's good. Okay, now there are basically 4 kinds of ions that are particularly important to us right at the moment. Sodium ions, these are the chemical abbreviations for these things, you probably know that already. Sodium ions, chloride ions. Sodium ions have a positive charge, chloride ions have a negative charge. Potassium is another one that has a positive charge. And then there are some large organic ions that are usually referred to as A, which doesn't stand for anything. It stands for anion. And there's some large positive ions that have a negative charge. And nerve cells have a lot of this stuff inside of them, but not outside of them. And nerve cells have a lot of potassium inside of them, but not very much outside of them. And outside of nerve cells, there's typically a lot of sodium ions and a lot of chloride ions. There are also some sodium ions inside, some chloride ions inside, some potassium ions outside. We'll talk about that in a minute. But predominantly, the lion's share of it is like this. Now, there's some rules, physical and chemical rules that we have to know about in order to understand all this stuff works. And most of these will probably be things that you either know already or that will make sense. But let's talk about them. So first of all, you probably learned somewhere along the line that if you have 2 positive charges or 2 negative charges, 2 like charges, the things that have those charges are repelled from one another. That's one of the fundamental laws of electrostatics. You probably, I know you all, I won't embarrass you. How many know that? Yeah. I was going to say how many don't know it, but I don't want to embarrass you. Okay. If it's the opposite way around, if you have 2 different charges, they tend to attract one another. So those are called electrostatic forces. Like charges repel, unlike charges attract. That's rule 1, which you all know. Another thing which is true, which you may not know, but if you think about it, it's kind of obvious, is that on the average, molecules move from regions where they're more highly concentrated. These aren't necessarily charged molecules, just any molecule. For regions where they are more highly concentrated to regions where they are less highly concentrated. Think about it. If you suppose you have a little eyedropper and you put some ink in the middle of a glass of water, very carefully, so you have a little thing in the middle. It's not going to stay there. It's going to spread all over the place after a while. That's an illustration of this fact. This is referred to as diffusion. And it happens because all the molecules are all in motion, because that's a fundamental property of molecules, except at absolute 0 temperature. And so they're all moving around at random, and eventually they'll all be uniformly everywhere. So instead of having a nice dark spot in the middle of your glass, you'll have a very faint blue spot or black spot, whatever, gray spot. Not spot. You'll have all the water in the glass will have a faint tinge because these molecules will get spread uniformly throughout. So those are diffusional forces. Then the last thing you have to know is that if there are more positive charges on one side of the membrane than the other, then if you take a voltmeter, the side on which there are more positive charges will be electrically positive, have a positive voltage relative to the other side of the membrane. One could give a definition of voltage, which you would not want to hear, but this makes intuitive sense. You took a voltmeter, the side that has more positive charges will be measured, but the voltmeter will measure it as positive relative to the other side. One last important fact. Remember we talked about the fact that the resting potential is about minus 90 millivolts, it's 60, 70, 80, 90 millivolts inside. Turns out that it takes, if you started out with equal numbers of positive and negative ions and everything on both sides of the membrane, so that you had no voltage difference across the membrane, it turns out that you would have to move very few negative ions inside, or very few positive ions outside, to make the inside 100 millivolts negative to the outside. So it doesn't require, you don't have to move a whole bunch of ions in order to produce a rather large voltage difference. I'm going to stop in just a second. Now, just to give you a bit of a sense, the batteries in this laser pointer and then your flashlight typically are 1.5 volts strength. And so the resting potential is about 1/10 of a battery in terms of how strong it is, just to give you a little bit of sense. Okay, we'll go on with this next time. I should have finished today. And I will give you I'll give you the slides for the next block of lectures because we only have about 10 more minutes of this to do. Yeah.
So can I have the test because I didn't do it.
Were you can't start the class late?
Yeah, I didn't aware there this online course like on quizzes on today. So
Let me understand better. So you were not enrolled in the course before? Or you were enrolled in the course?
yeah, I enrolled.
So why didn't you do the quiz?
I didn't realize that there's quizzes online. So that's kind of.
No. The answers for that one is already up. So you should do it on your own and go over the answers. But I can't let you. It'd be different if you hadn't been in the class at all. So you can't take it. Given the answers are already posted, I can't let you take it now. But you should take it yourself and study the answers and make sure you understand them. The quizzes are very little credit anyway, so it's not going to matter to your grade. The only reason for giving credit is to encourage people to do it. But I don't think I can let you take it now that the answers are already up.
But the yesterday one, but you haven't posted the answer yet?
You can do that one, yes.
So
Give it to Natasha, just print out the quiz and circle the right answers and give it to her.
Okay, sure. So,
Okay.
Like now.
In the next day or so. Okay, wait a minute. Do it by midnight tonight.
Okay. So,
And then can you do that?
yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah.
So
Okay.
where can I find the quiz?
Oh, you haven't even seen any of it.
CLE, the website?
Talk to her.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you on their CLE?
Yes.
good.
But
Wait, sorry. Hold on. Let me just get undone here because the next class is going to come in. I'm going to be in the way. Okay, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, so that's a Word document. Just fill that out. Just your like my email is of course in the future.
Hold on, you're still recording.
Okay.
Stop that.
So yeah, so